Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is August 11th, 2022, and this is your daily Ukraine update. And we are going to try to take a look at the satellite photos of the destruction of the Russian airbase in Crimea, and I'm going to share with you guys exactly what I think happened. Let's get into it. First off, guys, as always, your daily update is that there's not really much of a daily update. In fact, there's literally no changes to the front line at all, which again sort of makes sense based on the tendency of Russia to only push when they have the resources to do so. What's more interesting, though, is, of course, no movement on the Kherson front. That sort of makes sense, though it's sort of fascinating when we take a look at the news update that some Ukrainian officials sort of obliquely allude to the fact that the August 9th attack on the Russian airbase in Crimea marks the start of the Kherson offensive. I'm going to be honest, I'm a little skeptical. The Kherson offensive has been ready to start for like weeks, and there's still no real public acknowledgement that they've seized any territory. So it's tough to know if this is sincere or just sort of obfuscation. Though I do think it's interesting that Ukrainian officials have now begun to discuss liberating Crimea, which is a bold, even increase in Ukraine's ambitions in the war, which, you know, up until this point were discussions of restoring the annexed territory, less Crimea, which, of course, if you guys remember, was seized much earlier than the rest of the Ukraine and the separatist regions, and more explicitly by Russia. And the international community bizarrely just sort of acquiesced to it. But what's very much more interesting to me is the attack on the Russian airbase in Crimea for a couple reasons. First, as ISW points out, Russian officials are still confused. There's still different stories that they are giving about this airbase attack. It was over 100 miles behind Russian lines, which is beyond the range of weapon systems that Ukraine is known to have. Doesn't mean they don't have them, just means that we as public consumers aren't aware of it. And which now they say destroyed at least 8 Russian aircraft and multiple buildings, confirmed via satellite imagery. And we're going to take a look at that satellite imagery in a minute. But what's interesting is that initially Russia said no aircraft were destroyed. And obviously when you see the satellite imagery, you'll know just how wildly untrue that is. Right? Russian outlets, the Russian Ministry of Defense, claimed that these were munitions detonated at a storage site in the airfield due to negligence. And we're going to take a look, and I'm going to break down why I don't think that's the case. Some said it was likely caused by a missile strike. I actually don't think that's the case either. Or negligence, or a small helicopter bomb attacking a nearby parking lot. A bunch of theories. I don't think any of them are right. Where Ukrainian officials have been a little more explicit. They said an anonymous Ukrainian official told the New York Times that the attack was carried out with the help of partisans. Another official said it was Ukrainian special forces. I think actually both of those things are true. There's been a few other long-range missile strikes by Ukraine, but they are within the range, also in Crimea, but they're within the range of known Ukraine weapon systems, 100 and 170 kilometers away from the front lines. So let's take a look at the satellite photos, and I'm going to break down exactly why. First, let's look at the August 9th, the array of this airbase before these attacks occurred. Now, what I want to call your attention to is the fact that basically every one of these aircraft has their own foxhole, for lack of a better term. These are berms that are constructed on 3 sides that form a protective sort of protective layer around the aircraft. Now remember, this is 100 miles from the front lines, so I don't think this is the reason these exist is primarily for combat readiness, since the chances of the aircraft being engaged on the ground with Ukrainian weapon systems is very low. I think these are installed expressly to prevent, to contain accidents. So that if, let's say, you're refueling or arming this aircraft and there's an accident, someone lights a cigarette and ignites the jet fuel, or a munition has a manufacturing flaw and explodes, then what you're going to have is that explosion is going to be directed up and out, and crucially away from the other aircraft in the area, right? So it would have to literally pass through two different berms in order to damage this aircraft here. It doesn't mean it's impossible, just means that it's going to take a big strike to do so, right? And you can see almost each individual aircraft has its own little foxhole, for lack of a better term. You can also see to the south here, we are seeing the flight line, right? This looks like the flight jets that I believe are more ready for sorties. So here's what I think this is. I think this is where the jets are fueled and armed, because again, that's going to be the most dangerous part of the process, where you want those jets to be contained. You also, I suspect, have this and this building here, which I hypothesize that perhaps one of these is maintenance and one of these is fueling. These, I'm not sure what these would be. I'm intrigued that these, whatever these are, they are worth protecting with a berm themselves. Though I suspect these may be maintenance, like not maintenance hangars, but maintenance facilities. You can see here, this is another line that again may be a maintenance area where there's no protection. But I think these are protected parking spots, and these buildings here are probably munitions, right? You can see they're set away, munitions or fuel, because they're set away from the other aircraft spots. They are, this one is quite far away from other aircraft and the flight lines. So that's why I suspect that these may hold, again, those munitions and fuel. And then I think the aircraft are armed, they're brought through here and are put on the flight line for their final preparations to fly their sorties, right? So these are probably the most combat ready aircraft. That's my thesis. Though again, I suspect I could be wrong, and we'll take a look at why in a second. But anyway, let's take a look at the after effect. First off, let's acknowledge that these are commercial satellite photos, and they are great. Okay, so remember, the Russians initially claimed 0 aircraft were destroyed, but I want you to take a look. First off, is there any confusion at all that this was an aircraft and is no longer an aircraft, right? No doubt. We can confirm that at least 1, 2, possibly 3, 4, 5, 6, right? This may be a 7th, and there may be an 8th right here. It's tough to say. Or rather, I think it is, we are dead to rights on 7. There's just no way they're not, right? And I believe there's another 2 that are maybes. And then I think actually down here, there may be up to 4 or 5 other damaged aircraft that were able to be towed away. So let's break down, let's try to do a little bit of a battle damage assessment. And I am not a munitions expert, but I do have some limited training in identifying sort of IEDs, which are nothing more than planted explosives. So why do I not think this was a missile strike? Well, first off, the early reports indicated that there were around a dozen explosions. And so that would mean that you would have potentially either a single missile and then a dozen secondary or 11 secondary explosions, or a volley of missiles hitting, again and again. Well, if you were to see a dozen missiles, what would you expect? Well, you would expect them to produce a dozen craters. And we can see a fairly large crater here, a fairly large crater here, a very small crater here, and that's about it. And so that says to me that given the wild difference in sizes and the fact that, frankly, this may also be a crater, it's tough to say if this is a crater or just a very hard burn that occurred right here. But we're really not seeing a sequence of strikes, missile strikes. And I'll explain why here. So if this were a missile strike, right? This I can believe. A single missile strike hits right here and damages 1, 2, 3 aircraft that all somehow catch fire and burn, right? It seems very likely that these two would take some damage, but look at the strike. It would actually be pretty hard to really wallop this aircraft, given the fact that it's protected by this berm. It's not impossible, but it's tough. Also, though, what missile strike took this out? Right? You would have to have leapt over this protective berm and this protective berm, and the explosion somehow would have had to have hit this. But remember, explosions are up and out. So how? How does this aircraft get destroyed from this explosion? It doesn't really compute. You also ask yourself, what has destroyed this aircraft? Perhaps this strike would have leapfrogged across this to here. The point is, all of these, it really would be tough to destroy this many aircraft in individual, when each aircraft has its own individual foxhole. This is a huge order. And also, it's not clear what destroyed this. There's no real crater here. So I'm not going to say there's no chance there was a missile strike, right? But I think it's way more likely that you're looking at partisan and special forces activity. And the reason I think this was done by human beings, by a human team, is because of how deliberate each explosion is, right? You can see, right, if this were to be, let's say this aircraft here were to be damaged by this or this missile strike. Well, why then is there just like a little dirt here? And just, there isn't like a natural flow of damage up onto and through these aircraft. Instead, what it looks like is that there were smaller explosives planted that burned this fuel dump, because this looks like it was a building that was burned down, so something in it was highly flammable. Then you have an actual explosion here, because you can see, look at the field of debris this creates in contrast to this. I think this is the munition storage. I think the crater here is the munitions themselves cooking off, right? That's what you would expect from a munition storage site. You'd expect it to, well, leave a crater because it is just a box full of explosives. Then you have this here, right? Which is this another like site of structures. I think this may have been another munitions storage area, and that's why this is a huge crater. And then I think you have individual explosives planted on these aircraft. And what I expect happened is that the aircraft who were in different states of fueling, different levels of armament, burned differently. So this aircraft, right, burned on its left half. This one burned, looks like about 2/3. This one burned down entirely, right? Very common in these partisan type of attacks is that sometimes you will have an a bomb that doesn't go off. That's what I think happened here. But I think each one of these aircraft has been individually targeted. And if I was like sort of on the fence, right? Until you look down at the lower part of the screen here. Now look, we can see that each aircraft is parked on directly. Its nose is right on the flight line. So when we look here, you can see there are scorch marks right under each individual aircraft's location. And there's no scorch marks, not a single sign of a burn on any of the maintenance gear, supplies, readiness stuff to the left or right of these aircraft. These are almost entirely intact in almost the exact same formation that they were when they started. It's a really precise, individualized targeting that you would never see from a missile strike, right? Missile strike, you would see it hit, say, here, and then just sort of expand out with some exceptional with some secondary explosions and secondary scorch marks around. Just doesn't seem quite right. So that's why I think these are the work of partisans. Now, or special forces, actually, right? What I think happened, here's my thesis, is that, we've talked in the previous video about the fact that the partisan or guerrilla resistance to Russian occupation has actually coalesced and seems to be very well connected to Ukrainian special services and is also very well organized. So what I suspect happened is that partisans who are residents of Crimea have all the necessary documentation, have proper licensing on their cars, everything they needed to pass from the DNR, LNR into Crimea. That's actually been a huge part of Russia's efforts, is to bring sort of these breakaway areas into the fold of Russia proper. And so the partisans were the ones who probably facilitated the movement of a Ukrainian special forces team through enemy lines, linked up with the partisans, brought them into Crimea. The partisan group also probably conducted intelligence operations, assessing exactly what all these things are. For example, if someone was just sitting on the road, they would see, hey, it would be obvious to an observer on the ground which one of these had the munitions and which one had the fuel, right? It would also be obvious the order where flight line operations go. Oh, they go from here down to here, and then they take off down the runway. So all of that intelligence, plus the location, the schedule, that would probably be provided by partisans who would assess, hey, it seems like flight operations wind down around 4 p.m. There's lots of maintenance. There's no maintenance crews at 2 a.m. on any of these aircraft, right? They would provide that sort of insider intel that you couldn't get otherwise. They may even have, if they follow sort of the Taliban tactics, they may have an insider working on the base, some sort of Crimean official or some sort of low level, like a janitor type role, or a delivery person, right? Someone who has a tertiary, enters the base but has like a pretty tertiary role, can be very valuable in providing both intelligence and potentially even literally just leaving the door open for the Ukrainian Special Forces team. So the partisans facilitate everything, and then the actual Ukrainian team enters. They have the small, very reliable explosives that they then plant on every single aircraft. I would suspect that they would probably have those explosions on a timer, and that they would plant on all the aircraft they could, and then exfil the same way they left. They may do it sneaky ghost recon operation type deal. Though honestly, it's Russia and they're 100 miles behind Russian lines. They probably just had Russian uniforms on. They probably just figured out whatever the maintenance crew wears. Again, good partisans will tell you exactly what the maintenance crew is. And then just literally walked from aircraft to aircraft, just sticking explosives on there. And then just walked right out the door again, climbed into the car, and drove off. And so by the time, right, these explosions, these weapons, munitions were probably on a timer. They probably went off 6 hours after the team left. So the team was probably near the front lines getting ready to pass back to Ukrainian territory when these aircraft detonated. So all in all, that is my thesis on what happened. I'll be very curious to know if more information comes out. Of course, if any of my viewers are experts or served in a Soviet-style army or the Russian military and knows these flight operations and can add additional context, by all means, let me know in the comments. And of course, if you want to see me break down some combat videos too spicy for YouTube, you want to become a member of the Patreon. Link is in the description. Thanks, my Lieutenant tier patrons. See you guys later.